Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to cover serverless functions. In this module, I'm going to go over basically what a serverless function is. We'll be talking about some of the various different things we can do with serverless functions, some of the other technologies that are out there, and some of the other videos which we're going to have as well. We'll do some pretty nifty things with serverless. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So serverless functions are effectively functions that you don't need to set up a server for. They are serverless, right? Which makes them really quite interesting. You don't have to worry about that pesky infrastructure. You don't have to set up a virtual machine. You don't have to set up a physical server somewhere. You just define a function in your language of choice, as long as it's supported by your cloud provider, and you execute it, right? You're going to take this cloud function. I keep calling it cloud functions. They're serverless functions in general. Cloud Functions is Google specific. AWS, it's Lambda functions. Microsoft Azure, it's Azure functions. But basically, these are just things that you define in your cloud platform. Now, they're triggerable in multiple ways. Right? You don't just call function one with parameters. You have to trigger it through, say, a web call of some kind, like a URL or a curl command or something of that nature. But they're very, very useful. They're very, very powerful. And it turns out you can use quite a lot of them for free until you start having to get charged for that. All of that information is in the blog post about, figuring out pricing and things of that nature. But really, you can get by with a lot of function calls before you start having to pay for it. So let's take a look at what we can do in Google Cloud at least. So I'm going to go to Cloud Functions. Got Cloud Functions here. Let me zoom in a little bit. So Cloud Functions. And I don't have any created on this project, so we're going to go ahead and create a very, very simple one. What's going to happen is we'll get the hello world of Cloud Functions, basically return hello world. So let's call this hello world. So our function name is hello world. We get to pick a region. Again, pick the region that is closest to your clients or to yourself if you're the one using this. And then we get to basically say, how are we triggering this function? And what triggering means, again, is how do we execute it? Again, we don't have a local function on our computer that we're calling. We're not importing it in Python or Java or C# or whatever. We're triggering a remote function. We can use HTTP. We can use some of the various technologies on our cloud provider, like um, we can use Firebase. We can use PubSub, which PubSub we'll get to a little bit later when we talk about managed messaging. We could have a trigger occur when something happens with our cloud storage. Maybe we have a bucket that's becoming overfilled. We trigger a function to do something else. We're going to leave it as HTTP just so that we can have a nice, easy way to trigger this thing. And then, lastly, we have authentication. Who is allowed to use this function? I'm going to set it as allow unauthenticated. This is a horrible idea in practice because you see the URL here for my function that will be created. Anybody in the world could call this function and it would execute if I don't authenticate you. Now, what happens with authentication is that you can set up groups, you can set up IAM, which is the identity and access management. We'll talk about that very soon. There are multiple ways that you can go ahead and figure out who is using your service and if they're authorized to use that by being part of this group. Keep in mind it is something you should be doing. For ease of use right now, I'm going to allow it to be open. Maybe you have unlimited credits and you don't care. That's possibly fine too. But in the future, we'll be authenticating our users basically. And when we're in here, we have other settings that we can set as well. So it's hidden by default. In the past, this was part of it. You can set how much memory your function will consume. So it starts with 256 megabytes. You can go up to 4 gigs. How long will it take before your function times out? Meaning, how long does it take to process? If it takes longer than 60 seconds, you'll get an error message back saying the function died, basically. How many instances are allowed to be alive at the same time? So basically, are you handling traffic spikes nicely, kind of a thing. And then you can also set who is using, which account is actually serving this. So for me, the defaults are fine. If you have a more beefy function, you probably want to bump these up a little bit. You can also set environment variables. This is a little bit more advanced. Maybe you need some kind of a variable to work with. Something to basically look at if you, again, need more power for your functions. Again, for what we're doing here, all the basics are fine for us. You start getting into heavier functions, then you probably want to start looking into those. So I'm just going to go ahead and click save here. All right, so next, so what we see here, before we go into it, we get a nice little summary. Again, I'm going to copy this to my clipboard, but this is the URL for this function. After this video goes away, I'm going to delete this so you're not going to have this to be publicly accessible. But what we see is the region ID dash the project ID dot cloudfunctions.net slash your function name. This will be standard across all Cloud Functions. So if you need to, say, manually build this in code for whatever reason, here's your region, here's your project ID, here's your function name. Let's go ahead and click next. Now we get to pick the language that we're using. So you select the runtime. I can use .NET Core, I can use Go, I can use Java, I can use Node, I can use Python, or I can use Ruby. You'll note that a lot of these are in beta. Basically, they're at Google, they're working through incorporating the languages. When I started using Cloud Functions, it was only Node or Python 2. Python 3 was the exciting thing. But, now you see Python 9 support in here. So I'm going to click Python because, well, I like Python. But if you're a Node.js user, hey, here's Node.js code for handling an HTTP request. You get your index.js, so this is the file that's going to be called. You get a package.json, which is basically going to be the modules you're using. In Python, let's go Python 3.8, you see a main.py and a requirements.txt. If you're a Python user, it makes perfect sense, right? Here's my script. Here are all the modules that I'm going to need to serve this function. And you can import a ton of common Python modules, right? There is a list out there. I don't have it handy, but basically, if there is a fairly standard common module, it's generally importable. So let's look at the actual function here. So we can specify an entry point, meaning that when we trigger this Cloud function, it's going to call this function. And by default, it's going to be whatever you named your Cloud function, right? So hello world, hello world. We see the same for, Node.js, hello world, hello world. This is a actual script file. You can define multiple functions, you can define classes, treat it like a normal Python or your language of choice environment. Right, so I've got in here, hello world, we're sending in an HTTP request. And in terms of Python, it's basically spinning up a Flask web server. So it's using the Flask module to handle a web request. Right, so we're going to get some JSON here, and I don't know why we're getting some weird syntax highlighting going on. But let's get user input. If they exist, and there is the query string message in there, the query variable message, return that message. And if you're sending a JSON packet, return the message parameter of that JSON packet. Otherwise, return hello world. And we can modify this. Let's, I don't know why the syntax is all wonky. Maybe it's because I'm zoomed in so much. Let's zoom back out. Yeah, that's not fixed things. I'm going to leave this in just because it's always fun to see when problems go wrong. I think zooming in and out kind of messed with the function. So let's call this hello world. Go back to US East. Basically, I just refresh the page. Unauthenticated, save, next. Make this Python. Yeah, and there we go. So let's return, oh no, it's still messed up. That is so interesting. Wow. Very interesting. I'm not sure what's going on with the editor here. I tried it on multiple screens. I tried restarting, and I'm getting very bizarre behavior. I should note that you can also work on this locally and upload a zip archive of your code and the requirements pack or your package.json or whatever your language you're using. But basically, I just modified hello world and I changed it to hello there. So I'm going to hit deploy. And what we're going to see is that this function is going to create it, and this is going to take a moment to spin up. Every time you make a change to your Cloud Function, you're going to have to save it, and then it will have to be deployed. While it's being deployed, it's basically spinning up the infrastructure behind the scenes that it needs to run, and it will be very quickly instantiated when, say, somebody calls your Cloud Function here. So you see it's bopped over to US Central. That's just because I deleted it and recreated it again. But we see the trigger, we see the runtime, how much memory it has, the function being called, is it authenticated, and then we have some extra actions here as well. We will get into logging, don't worry. But I'm going to go ahead and click this so I can show you what we do in the interim. We have a nice little panel here with all the metrics of your Cloud Function. Once we start using this thing, you'll basically see how often your Cloud Function is being called, how long each call will be taking over time, how much memory is being used, how many active instances there are, basically all the data you need for your Cloud Function. We can look at a little bit more details. We're talking about REST later on, but hey, here's a nice little RESTful JSON call if you need it. If you click source, you can go ahead and edit this if you need to. You can set your environment variables that we talked about before. Hey, the little green check mark popped up. That means we're live. You can click trigger to get the URL to trigger this thing. You can, again, set permissions. We'll get into that in a future module. Logs, you get a live log to show you exactly what's happening, including errors if that's happening. And you can also set some tests, which we will look at again later on. But I'm just going to copy and paste the URL there. So, hello there. Neat. Again, we can return an HTML, just raw text if you send it through the browser. We can also use the Cloud Shell, or really any terminal, and use curl to get this response as well. So while this is provisioning here, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a terminal on my machine. Oops. So here I've got Ubuntu on Windows. I can just type in curl, put the link in there, and I see hello there. Again, I can access this function in multiple ways, and I can use it over here as well. So now that I'm in the Cloud Shell, curl, and again, curl interacts with the web service. Hello there. So you have a very, very basic introduction to Cloud Functions. Again, I could change this to, do whatever I want. I don't have to return a simple string. I could be interacting with other services. Now let's say curl message equals hi. I'm hesitant to go back and edit this because the editor is still messed up here, for me at least, but we see hi pop up there. If I go ahead and, oops, get my trigger back. Okay, yes, let's redirect. I can put my query string, question mark, message equals hi. Right, so there's my query string. I return hi. And again, that's because my function is looking for the keyword message there. Anyway, small issues with the editor aside, this is a very, very powerful environment that you can easily trigger with HTML, with a simple, curl command. You can interact with it through the other Google services as well. We'll get into a little bit more advanced use cases, but to get you started, here's a very simple web page that you could honestly host if you want it. Anyway, that's all for now. I will see you in the next video.